Wominjenka, welcome. Thank you for joining our special AFAC webinar today, co-hosted with the Country Fire Authority of Victoria. My name is Deb Sparks and I'm the Aviation Research and Evaluation Manager, at the National Aerial Firefighting Centre, which is part of AFAC, the Australian and New Zealand Council for Fire and Emergency Services. I am so delighted to be hosting this session today for everybody. To start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm joining from today. That's Corran Warrable in the Dandenong Ranges, east of Melbourne, and acknowledge the country is of significance to the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people. I also recognise the traditional custodians of the many lands represented here online today, and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders participating in the event. I pay my respect to elders past and present and acknowledge the enduring connection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to country, culture and community. As AFAC is a trans-Tasman organisation, I also pay my respects to Ngāiwi Maori as Tangata Whenua and Treaty of Waitangi partners of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Before I introduce our speakers, I just have a couple of housekeeping notes. Today we're going to use both the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom. It can get a little bit confusing, so let me lay out the difference for you. The chat function is for general thoughts and reflections as we go through the presentations. You can share where you're coming from today, what agencies, all of that sort of stuff in there. But if you want to pose a question to Kristy and Nick for me to ask at the end of the presentation, please put it in the Q&A section. You can also upvote questions in the Q&A. Just click the little thumbs up button and I'll be working through the questions in order of how many thumbs up they have. I'd also like to remind us all to be respectful and inclusive in any of the communications, both in the chat and the comments today. I know someone will ask this during the presentation, so I'm just going to put it out there that we are recording the session today, and the recording and the slides will be made available on the AFAC events proceedings page. The link is going to pop up in the chat, or you can subscribe to the AFAC newsletter and we will send out the link when it becomes available. Right, well, on to the main business of the day, and that is the presentation. So since 2021, the Country Fire Authority and the Victorian Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action have been undertaking research into suppression effectiveness in grass and bushfires. Today's webinar is going to explore the key learnings from this research, which found discrepancies between the way suppression occurs on the fire ground and how it's been represented in research and modelling to date. In order to showcase the different frameworks that address some of these realities, I would like to introduce our speakers. Both from the Country Fire Authority, we have Kristy Butler, Lead Data Scientist, and Dr. Nick McCarthy, Senior Research and Development Officer. Their bios will be shared in the chat, so that leaves me free to hand the presentation straight over to Kristy and Nick. And I believe Kristy is going to kick off. So welcome, Kristy and Nick, and off you go.
Great. Thanks so much, Deb, for that introduction. Just checking quickly, you can hear us?
We can indeed.
Excellent. So we're going to start today's presentation firstly with straight into an example of effective suppression. So what you're looking at here is simulations of two fires that were reported on Black Saturday, which was Victoria's worst fire disaster in terms of lives lost. These simulations are moving at approximately the same time and space scale. And for both of these fires, at the time the fires were reported, the grass fire danger index was well over 200. So generally what we consider to be beyond the limits of effective suppression. In both cases for these fires, they were detected within minutes. They were responded to within 5 minutes, and there were CFA crews at the fires within 10 minutes. Now, the fire on the right is the Kilmore East fire, which killed 119 people and destroyed over 1,200 homes. The fire on the left, the simulation that you're seeing there, didn't actually eventuate because crews got to that fire and were able to suppress it in the initial attack phase. There's a really great quote in the radio chronology from that fire that it was a lucky save. And I think you can see that the impact it would have had on an urban interface if it had not been suppressed in initial attack. So the question that you'd want to ask immediately on seeing something like this is, why did one fire cause so much destruction and the other one didn't? And the answer to this question to firefighters is actually not that difficult. So this is a bit of a summary of the limits of suppression that we've discovered from talking to firefighters and operations staff over the past few years. And it pretty much goes most of the way to answering the question as to why one was so destructive and the other not, and why one was suppressed and the other wasn't. The fire on the left was in kind of quite a barren paddock. It had really good access. It was really flat and trucks were able to get to it really quickly. On the other hand, at Kilmore East, the location and the topography of that area, it's really rocky and hilly. There were flame heights that were higher than the truck and not readily suppressible by ground resources. So it didn't really it was beyond this limit of suppression. The challenge is that whilst firefighters and fire agencies are familiar with these limits, this isn't really being translated into policy, science, and the public understanding. There's still kind of this perception that if we just get one more helicopter or get trucks there a little bit faster, we'll be able to put the fires out, and that will be the end of it. The goal of our presentation today is to sort of talk about some of the work that we've been doing to capture these things that firefighters already know, and some new frameworks and ways that we can translate this into evidence, and hopefully start to have the right conversations around suppression and what the limits are. So with that, what we're going to do today is talk you through the suppression effectiveness research program and what we did. We'll cover the key findings from doing this work. We'll talk about some frameworks and language that we can use to start to describe suppression better in evidence, finish with some takeaways and some questions at the end, as Deb said. So I'll hand to Nick to talk a bit about suppression effectiveness projects.
Suppression effectiveness research didn't start in 2019. There is a long history of it in Victoria, as well as working with our partners in the state. What we're showing here is a project, a photo from Project Aquarius, which happened in Gippsland in 1983, 1984. There should be a link actually that comes up to the chat about that project. And just to acknowledge, there's been a huge body of work up until this point on this topic. But clearly we still have these questions that we do need answer from an evidence-based perspective in agency. So to then start to talk about, well, what happened in 2019? Well, the differences between where we are now and where we have been in the past is a huge amount of new technology, which we'll speak to, a collection of new data sources and just more jar data in general. We are living in an age of obviously a lot of big data, but still have these outstanding questions of suppression, and they could be tactical or strategic or from a fire agency business perspective, from an investment perspective. And we still have high consequence fires. So there's still a lot to be learned in this space. So if we then start to look at what happened in 2019, there was the ERP 12 project, which was funded by the Victorian Safer Together project. The Safer Together program is really responsible for implementing Victoria's bushfire risk reduction strategy, and acknowledging that as a part of that, suppression is a really important lever. So this phase of the work between 2019 and 2021 was done in partnership but contracted out to CSIRO. And so here and throughout the presentation, we'll obviously talk a fair bit to the work of Matt Plazinski, who really set this work in motion for the Victorian agencies in its most recent iteration. Matt and CSIRO, as a part of that project, delivered us a report that had a second set of recommendations. And really those recommendations got to the fact that this is a really data scarce sort of environment. If we had all the data, we probably would be able to answer all of our questions about effectiveness of resources. But many of those recommendations were much more around how do we actually improve the data quality to be able to start answering these questions. And that was both primary and secondary data as we speak to. So there was a body of work between phase 2 and 3 there, which was really about the acceleration of the internal tools and data cleaning in many ways we needed to answer those questions. And then we get to what we're talking and presenting to on today, which was much more about the frameworks and the implementation of some of this work. So to speak a little bit to the methods here, I will note that there's going to be, I think, a fair number of links that come into the chat to some of the work if you really want to dive into the methods. But our focus today is going to be more on the results and some of the implications of those results and the frameworks rather than necessarily these methods. But obviously we have a huge amount of data from our operational systems. Purely just the amount of mapping and information we have in a spatial sense has improved dramatically. But what we found and what we continue to find is that really can't be separated out context-wise from what actually happened in the field, as Kristy already sort of spoke to. So the role of these case studies and reconstructions really quite important there, and also a bit of primary data gathering we did around instrumenting some of our tankers to look at flow rates and that sort of very action low level stuff. But then the resource tracking data, and so Victoria's had this now for a good few years, but it's now at this point where it's a level of completeness across our fleet where when we have that context and when we can connect it to some of those spatial systems, we can actually put enough context around that resource tracking information about what our suppression resources were doing when to be able to answer some of these questions. And then, of course, there's the modelling analysis bit. So the statistics, the publications, the peer review, the hard work that goes into actually getting this to a standard that we can sort of, yes, put our hats on from a policy perspective. But throughout this process, the theme continues to be that the challenge of garbage in, garbage out. If we don't have good underlying data, it's just not going to be able to allow us to answer that question. So hopefully that sets some of the context around the way we've approached this. It would be really amiss of me to not mention the huge amount of collaborators and support that we've had in this project. So first and foremost, the CFA and Forest Fire Management Districts, regions and firefighters who have all been instrumental. And it's a really high trust exercise, right? Because there is a reading of this that is saying that, we have scientists trying to pull out the clipboards and figure out exactly the efficacy. But by doing it in partnership, we can achieve a little bit more. Because obviously the project team in-house, our collaborators at CSIRO, an all-star project reference group. And then there's quite a few bits and pieces of what we'll talk through today that relates to some collaborations we've had with the US Forest Service and their wildland fire risk management science team, which has been really instrumental.
So I will start to talk about some of the findings that we've had from doing all those different things that Nick has been describing. And our first finding that I'm going to start with is that most fires that are reported and attended by our fire agencies in Victoria are not actually spreading. So most of the time when a fire gets reported to our agencies, it looks something like this or like this. So examples of these are burn-offs that might be attended or allowed sort of outside of the fire danger period. It might be a campfire or a backyard fire that isn't spreading. And they have sort of narratives with them that when we look into fire reporting, that we see things like this. So a legal burn-off, a campfire, a column of smoke, or some sort of vehicle fire. And there's some stricter agency terminology around a grass and scrub fire for CFA versus a non-structure fire. But across the board, we see these sorts of fires that are not spreading. And when we look through the data set of all fires in Victoria over sort of the past 25 years, we've come up with this idea of how we could separate out what is a spreading fire versus what is not a spreading fire. So these are just 5 flags we've been using to identify when we have a spreading fire. So, for example, if we have data such as a mapped fire area, so if you go on to our systems such as EMAP and can see a fire area, or if there's a fire area recorded to it, we know that that fire was spreading. There's also flags, things like a public warning was issued for the fire, or if in the radio logs or the situation reports, there's notes about the fire spreading, that it had some sort of escalation, and that it doesn't have terms like it wasn't found or not spreading or unattended. We've done some validation of this kind of method, and we've figured out it kind of works about 85% of the time. So it's a pretty good method for identifying and separating out spreading from non-spreading fires. And the importance of this finding is that when we apply this methodology across the whole data set, we find that across the year, about 81% of fires are not spreading. They still require agency attendance, but they're sort of those examples of those photos I showed before. Interestingly, though, that applies also on days that have elevated fire danger day. So we did some analysis of catastrophic fire danger days, and we found even on those days, we have 52% of fires that are not spreading. The significance of this is that when we start to use fire reporting data sets for modelling, we need to be careful about what sort of goes into these. So traditionally, there's some models that predict whether a specific fire is going to be contained in initial attack. And these sorts of models don't really have good performance. Historically, that's probably because we are including a whole bunch of ignitions in there that are not spreading fires. So the examples that I showed before. So then when you put in all the weather, vegetation, topography, access sort of variables into there, you get this effect where the model gets a bit confused, because even in sort of the most extreme end of conditions, we get these fires that are actually contained when crews arrive at the fire. As part of this work, though, we took out all these fires and tried to see if we could develop a model that would predict whether a fire was going to be contained in initial attack. And we found it really doesn't work very well. So you don't need to understand the complexity of this graph, but basically we would expect a good model to do, to look more like this. And so part of the work and what I've been talking about, this project being really important for looking at what actually happens on a fireground versus how we sort of picture it, we decided to have a look at kind of where the model wasn't getting things right. So where are we getting initial attack success or failures where we wouldn't expect them to? And the challenge was that we were sort of seeing suppression happening on firegrounds a bit like this. So what you're looking at here is a reanimation of resource tracking data. So the triangles that are moving around are CFA tankers, and the yellow there is the fire perimeter as it spreads. And what you're seeing is a fairly typical grass fire attack. So tankers are moving along the northern flank of that fire, putting in some suppression. But unfortunately, in this case, the fire is running faster than they can put in that suppression. So that fire got away in initial attack. So we sort of were thinking of suppression as happening in the initial attack phase like this. However, when we sort of started to look at more examples, we found some different things were happening. So again, this is another animation of a different fire. And what you can see is as the trucks arrive, so the red triangles, most of them are sort of hanging out near the point of origin of the fire. And the reason for this was that there was a lot of assets in that area where the fire had started. So houses, sheds, vehicles. And there was still fire in that area. And so most of the trucks that arrived were focused on protecting those assets ahead of suppressing the fire and trying to contain the fire. So when we started to look at what tankers and air resources were actually spending their time on at the fire, we can pull out this pie chart here, which shows that only sort of 37% of the resource time was actually spent on containing the fire. And we had all these other functions that were happening on this fire ground that was reducing the amount of suppression that could happen. We have examples from other fires where there's this other things affecting the amount of suppression that can go on. So this is quite a remote fire. And while it looks like there might be some water sources around there, they were actually dry at the time. And every time a resource arrived, they could do a small amount of suppression on the fire, but then they had to return for water. And it was about a 45-minute round trip for one truck to go from the fire ground, get water and come back. As a result, when you look at the time spent on activities for those vehicles, you can see that there's a really limited amount of time that's spent on containing the fire. It's only about 16% of their time. And the rest of it is spent on getting water, moving around the fireground. Another example with a real video this time. This shows a fire moving in grassland, and you'll see an aircraft comes in and puts in a drop. And I'm sure some of our operational people on the webinar today will be thinking, man, that drop could really use a bit of ground support, and we might be able to make a bit more difference if we had some trucks on the ground. They did actually have a lot of trucks at this fire. So this one isn't an animation, it's paused there specifically. But you can see there are a lot of trucks at this fire, but none of them are actually able to access the fire ground because it's extremely hilly country and they couldn't really get in there. So as a result, again, we see this containment proportion for the resources is really, really low. And we call these challenges that are happening on the fireground bottlenecks. So this bottleneck here that we're showing is an access one. So similar to what I talked about at the start, that you need to be able to access the fireground. We see these consistent themes around bottlenecks affecting the ability to do suppression in the initial attack phase. So things like access to the fireground, water sources, and the need to undertake things like asset protection ahead of containing the fire really impacts the amount of suppression that can be done.
Thanks, Kristy. And I suppose picking up from where Kristy left there in terms of we've talked about two things. One is that about 80% across the board of our grass and scrub and bushfires aren't necessarily spreading in when we first arrive and get there. The other part is about this bottlenecks. And in both instances, there's an argument to be made that they're not actually sensitive to the resources we send to them. We still need to send resources to them for a collection of reasons. But the amount of the loading of how many we push early might not be sensitive. There was a bit of work done with the RAND Corporation and the Forest Service in the US that looked to sort of promote, well, let's actually really focus in deeply on where we are sensitive to suppression. And realistically, that's a close call fire. It's something where maybe a few marginal resources would have made a difference. The spoiler for this is that it's already a question of access and the bottlenecks point still applies, but something else is happening here. So what I'm going to be showing you is a video that shows about 30 minutes, the first 30 minutes of suppression that happened on the Yarram Gap fire, which happened in the Grampians Garryward landscape in the 2024-2025 season. But what we've done is to take this helicopter footage and speed it up about 16 times faster than normal, so we can see that 30 minutes play out quite quickly. So a heads up, if you do get a bit motion sickness, this might be your chance to check what's going on in a different tab. But we'll see if this will play for us now. So what we're looking at, again, about 20, 30 minutes into this fire first being detected, already we have some retardant drops from fixed-wing aircraft across the head of the fire. And flicking back and forth between the visual and thermal, we can see that having an effect. You know, this sort of action level, this granular stuff that projects like Matt Blazinski White Fly project has really been looking into in detail. It is having an effect. But we see it's like this line ball sort of situation where there's a few spot fires over that retardant line, and it's sort of a bit in the balance, if you like. I'll probably let this play out and just sort of let you take in what happens for the next 20 seconds or so here. So just a couple of points to remark on while we're watching it. There's no tracks right up against this. It's quite a flammable fuel type. And as you start to see, there's this wind slope alignment, which gets into the quite technical fire behavior side of it. But once we hit that, we hit a really clear point where, this is no longer a fire that's going to be containable in initial attack because of what we know is about to happen as a result of this emerging fire behavior. And you'll see one last drop in here in a second that sort of speaks to the fact that it's probably on that really close call range by this point. So that's all good and well to speak to, but one of the really key points about this is we really can't separate that from the context in which that fire was happening, which was in the context of about 7 or 8 other ignitions throughout that landscape and that broader region that happened simultaneously. And so right off the bat, we have a common resource pool problem, right? So we have resources trying to pool and compete for the same set of resources. And we'll just play the animation here, zoomed out a lot more. But we'll see some of these fires start to pop up. So the one at Miranatwa there, successfully suppressed. One down to the south of Hamilton that pulled the aircraft down that way. Child's Lane and then Fields Track. And the Yarram Gap fire was the last one that occurred during that sequence of fires as they were popping up throughout the day. And so realistically, the stretching of resources in that context is really quite important to that video we saw of it being a bit blind ball. So there is a lot of context around these events, but we can still compare it to events, say, a few months after that, which is the Little Desert fire. So in January 2025, this was the first photograph from an aircraft over the top of this fire, obviously, again, in a really remote part of Victoria. And it, from first principles, we can pretty much say that this fire is not going to be contained in initial attack. This is probably less than an hour after the fire was actually reported. But it's probably into this other category where it starts to become insensitive to resources again from a containment perspective. That doesn't mean that this wouldn't be an incredibly resource-intensive fire. And we can actually look to that with things like our fleet utilisation rate. So again, showing similar data, and you can see the perimeters of the fire growing and just how exceptional the rate of spread was for this fire and all the resources that pulled in. Now, what you'll see to the south is we can still see our little Yarram Gap fire on there, but the ignitions that then started in the western side of the Grampians-Garryword landscape there. And what we're looking on the right is the sort of, as described by this resource tracking, the radio log, the radio GPS position, our fleet utilisation rate as we're going through that. And we're really at the maximum, and sort of that surge resources are the ones that are coming from outside the district there. But understanding how quickly we can ramp up that profile is still really important for a collection of reasons. Now, to speak a little bit to the work that when we do have that category 3 fire and we are faced with all these other sorts of consequence management tasks that we have, we're going back to, in the first slide, Kristy showed that simulation of the Kilmore East fire in 2009. And very simply what I've shown here is along the horizontal axis, the time since ignition in a simulation, and then the cumulative assets exposed. In this case, they are houses, but the key point here is that this isn't the number of houses lost. This is just, as the simulator sees it, the number of houses exposed through time. And then all we've done is very simply look to see where are flame heights less than 4 metres and where they're above 10 metres in the red and green, respectively, to basically that quick assessment of, are the flames bigger than the truck? And it just speaks to the ability to potentially profile this as a bit of a supply and demand problem, and then also acknowledge that there's still a lot of success, and in fact there is a lot of success that we do have even in these high-end category fires where they are insensitive to the amount of resources from the containment perspective. We are still having a lot of wins, but we don't have a huge amount other than lived experience of the work that happens in that sort of later phase. So we'll bring this together now with a few frameworks that help describe some of the phenomena in some better terms, including categories of fire, short fuse fire, and then some work on pods.
Great. So the first framework we want to talk about is this idea of categories of fire. So we've given you a lot of findings about sort of different types of fires and ones that are sensitive to resources versus ones that might not be spreading. And there's a lot of complexity in that. So we came up with this idea of bringing it into a simpler form. This isn't the idea of coming up with categories of fire is, of course, not ours. This is something that it's been talked about kind of across different spaces, but this is the one that we've been working with lately. So The first category, we call it a category 0. It's those non-spreading fires that we were saying appear across all days and all different conditions. And basically, these fires aren't really sensitive to resourcing, and because they're already contained when the agency attends them. So, so we can say a category 0 fire is essentially self-contained by the surroundings or weather. At the other end of the scale, we have these category 3 fires. And this is like the little desert one that Nick showed the photo of that first arriving resource, seeing this giant plume. And this is a bushfire, it's spreading and it's not containable in initial attack, regardless of what the resourcing that you send to it. However, as Nick pointed to, these fires are really resource intensive. And the resourcing is required for a different purpose, though. It's for that defensive firefighting tasks, such as asset protection and actions that support life safety, so things like rescue and evacuation. In the middle, we have 2 different categories. The first one is category 1, which is your fires that are spreading, but they're readily containable by sort of the default suppression resourcing. So this is usually in CFA terms about 5 tankers, and it means that the sensitivity of the timing and kind of the level of suppression effort that goes into these fires is less. So it doesn't really kind of matter exactly how quickly we get there. It's easily containable. It's spreading slow enough for that type of activity. But then on the other hand, we have the category 2 fires. And this is fires that are spreading, and they probably are containable in initial attack, but they're really sensitive to the timing and the type of resources that we send to them. So an example of this is the Yarram Gap fire that Nick played the sped up video from. And it's important to note that these fires are sensitive to, as I said, timing and weight of suppression effort. And if we get them in a context where we're resource limited, that's where these fires can get away from us. We've done some work to put some numbers to kind of what the workload of these fires is across the year. So this is over the course of 5 years, and we reckon it's about these proportions. So again, most of our workload for a fire agency sits in that category 0 and category 1 space, but the category 2 and category 3 fires are the ones where we really see those impacts. We can also bring in this concept of bottlenecks and resource allocation into the categories of fire. So when you're talking about initial attack success, we'd expect most of the time that category 0 and 1 fires will be contained in initial attack. However, there's a chance if there's some sort of bottleneck and we can't actually undertake suppression at the fire, then a category 1 fire could potentially lead to an initial attack failure. On the upper end, category 3 fires are never going to be contained in initial attack by definition. But the category 2 fires, if there's some sort of bottleneck affecting the ability to undertake suppression, or if we have that resourcing constraint, so in like a multiple ignition context, that's where we get category 2 fires escaping initial attack. And I think framing it in this way has some sort of leads us to some thinking about sort of how we could allocate resources between category 2 fires versus category 3 fires.
And speaking of category 3 fires, there's probably a fair bit of a conversation we want to be having about that. And so part of this work with some of our collaborators in the US, we did have a look at a collection of fires. Well, there's a database of fires that we can look at essentially the number of residential structures lost, so the houses. And we said we'll sort of look at everything where more than 100 structures were lost since 1999. And we're just showing a sample of them on the right where we can look at this idea of a fuse. And the context here is that for these fires in that 100 most destructive, those ones that where more than 100 structures were burned, 57% of them, the majority of those structures were lost within the first 24 hours. And then 80% of civilian fatalities happened within that first 24 hours. Now, this is something that probably isn't going to be a surprise to most firefighters, sort of the intuitive sense of those new fires where we don't have time and space to necessarily manage consequence. But just to highlight on this table on the right, some of the times involved in between that report and an impact on multiple structures in this case, for some fairly big name fires in there, including the recent fires in Los Angeles, Lahaina, the Marshall, Colorado fire. So just to note that. And so what we're sort of framing this as is a short fuse fire that's in itself defined by the exceptional rate of onsets of impacts. Now, these sorts of fires have been profiled in a bunch of different ways, and we know they're really fast and destructive. But this, I suppose, term that we're putting to it in short fuse fires is making it explicitly about the onset of those, the rate of onset of those impacts on life and property. We can then, as a part of this review, look to some of the themes. And so throughout the literature that included the scientific, published literature on this, as well as the sort of government grey literature here, there were some really key themes that come out that we've already sort of spoken to in different ways. So life safety operations taking priority over structure protection is a very consistent theme, and that's separate from any work of containment. It's not to say that containment can't, suppressing the fire through containment can't aid that, but this is ultimately where we find ourselves in these events. Then I suppose there's already, these last three can really be framed around the bottlenecks component of it. So physical access barriers, and yes, there's terrain, but this context around fire weather is severe weather. So falling trees on the way to the fire, damaged power lines preventing access to the fire, even in initial attack, and then the evacuation dimensions of that, all pretty consistent themes there. Not necessarily as consistent, but certainly in the very high-end weather events, we do have that challenge of simply not being safe or effective in some cases to fly, aircraft that is. And then the critical infrastructure failures. So we're relying on things like our power, communications, and water systems. And I think there's different anecdotes we can probably think for each of these fires, but they do tend to be consistent themes when we look across that set of really high-end fires that unfortunately we have seen more of. So if we were to frame this conceptually a little bit, what we're talking about and much of the work of the categories and the suppression effectiveness about initial attack, there's this window of opportunity for containment, which we typically think about for initial attack. Maybe there's some detection lag and some initial attack component of that. And then if that fails, then we have a huge demand for basically saving lives and property. But ideally, we prevent it before then. The challenge with these very high-end events is all of that demand for asset protection, defensive firefighting rescue is all front-loaded. And so we don't actually have the opportunity in these fires to engage in that work of suppression from an initial attack context. Again, we've said this a few times, but they are incredibly resource intensive, but those resources are just doing different things. There's this other point around, well, when fires get big, but there aren't necessarily people and homes in the way, we still have a lot of consequence to manage there. This is sort of a bit of here's one we prepared earlier type bit of work, because the US and the US Forest Service in particular have done quite a bit of work on this concept of potential operational delineations or pods. And the idea here is to sort of take suppression pre-plans and apply them to sort of fire catchments, if you like, in the landscape, but support that with spatial analytics. And so we did trial some of this in Victoria. And what we're showing there on the right is the suppression difficulty index, which is a quick way of describing how accessible or inaccessible places are, but also how difficult it is to work there once you get there. There's a few other different industries that support that, but the intent of them is to support pre-plans with analytics that are seeking to, I suppose, amplify the intuitive knowledge that any fire managers will have in these sorts of landscapes. And the intent really being like mutual understanding around that. And so there'll be some links in here about that. We don't have a huge amount of time to talk to it, other than to say, we look to the places in the landscape where we know we can safely and effectively engage with fire from the practitioner's perspective, blend that with a few analytics, in this case, the suppression difficulty index again there. But there's some other ways in terms of, how remote is this? If we need to get a firefighter out, what's the evacuation time for a medical reason, and sort of put these layers on to sort of agree upon a set of, spatially explicit ways in which we will engage with fires, including when they become large in the landscape, and ideally prevent that destructive part in the days and weeks as these fires grow.
So just to finish up before we go into some questions, the title of our presentation was what we have learned about the limits of suppression in the course of 5 years of doing research into suppression effectiveness. And I think it's probably easiest to summarize this by saying we haven't really learned much that firefighters didn't already know about the limits of suppression. But what we're aiming to do here is to really bring some of this operational fireground knowledge into frameworks and models that can be accessed and used in other ways. So the key things that we sort of went over very quickly today is firstly that we probably need some better language and frameworks to describe what actually happens at fires. So we throw around sort of this idea kind of that gets thrown around in the public that there's just kind of like, and then suppression happens. But we need to be a little bit more explicit when we're talking about what happens. Perhaps the fire isn't spreading and we just attend it. Perhaps we attend it and it's easily contained. Perhaps we attend it and there's defensive firefighting work that goes on. We need to be explicit about what we're actually talking about when we're using suppression as a term. The second thing is because of this bottlenecks thing, faster resourcing does not always mean more suppression. There's these operational challenges that come into the picture, things like access, availability of water, and the need to undertake other operations on the fireground that mean that doesn't scale linearly with more resources arriving quicker. Related to that, we found that not all fires are sensitive to resourcing. As I said, we have these category 0 and 1 fires that will always be part of our workload. And we have the category 3 fires that whilst need resourcing are not sensitive to the resourcing for containment.
I suppose picking up on that, this point around when we become insensitive to resourcing from an initial attack, we need to be clear, and in some instances we are, being clear about saying some fires are not suppressible in initial attack. To this point around short fuse fires and the study of the work there's lots that we can do, but being clear about the expectation about what's going to happen in those high-end events from a response and resourcing perspective is important. And then also just this note that from a landscape fire perspective, analytics do have a place to play there, and we do have some tools ready to go in that sense. Coming to, I suppose, where to from here, there's some pretty clear policy implications. And I want to start by talking to the difference between outcome measurement as compared to an agency target. So on the 9th of January this year, on a day of catastrophic fire danger in Victoria, the direction to all firefighters is hard and aggressive initial attack. That's not going to change. The role of that target is very, very important in setting, because we don't know this a priori. We don't know it until after the fact. And as to a lot of the papers we talked about, the models aren't, and the data that we have is not going to tell us that in advance. So we need to start with that assumption. However, when we get to that place of knowing that we're in that category 3 and we have all this other consequence management to do, we just need to set that expectation. So there's that agency target from a response perspective, but from an outcome measurement perspective, we talk to this idea of keeping all fires to 5 hectares or less. Now, we probably do need to have a conversation more broadly about what that means in the context of fires that we are not going to be able to contain in initial attack and how we should measure ourselves as agencies. To that point, the risk modelling that we do across the state, it already sort of acknowledges some of these dynamics implicitly. Currently, in the way we model risk in Victoria and many places around the world, we don't explicitly model suppression in terms of like the role of resources actually working along and containing fires. That's probably okay, because when we start to look at this more explicitly, we recognise that in this category 3 and this top end of fires, there's probably not as much of a role in particularly the containment part of it. But we do need to understand the sort of the thresholds and bottlenecks in particular that we know for particular landscapes are going to play out. And then the third point around being investment. And the challenge with, say, taking an econometric approach or looking for all the tools of economics to solve, how much we should be putting towards suppression is really, really difficult without this foundation. It's not clear, if our workload exists in these lower categories of fire, but then all our consequence management up here, there is a trade-off to be made there particularly around the role of early detection and response. And there's a real risk, and particularly with some of the public narrative around this at the moment, that increased and better detection times and faster response is always going to result in a better outcome, when we know that's not just the case. So that balance of investment piece there, really important. In terms of future work in this space, profiling bottlenecks and the agency learning piece, there's been a huge amount of internal demand for this from the agencies in Victoria, which is great, for the purposes of understanding these lessons ourselves. And it does need to be done in a sensitive way, but there are some real values for some of the tools we've developed for those after action review type environments. There's also this communication of the challenges part of this, and this is to the public, and we're reasonably good at fire agencies about being clear about this once we're in that place. But again, from a policy and communication perspective, before the fire starts, setting some of these expectations needs to be really clear, particularly if we come back to that idea of just how hard we're pulling on that suppression lever, and the sense of seeing a helicopter fly over and the expectation that it's going to be contained. We're already pulling incredibly hard on that response lever, but there's all these other levers actually in response that we probably need to profile the efficacy of as well. So this defensive firefighting and looking at that supply and demand and understanding how we can best position ourselves to respond to destructive fires, particularly with regards to things like our resource topology, which might be reflective of where we have actually different needs than just more resources being the answer. And with that, I will leave it to questions. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Nick and Kristy. My head is absolutely spinning. We've obviously, your research has got international attention, because I've seen people in the comments from the UK and Canada and the US. So looks like we've got a bit of a worldwide spread of people keen to get their hands on some of this research outputs. I'm going to ask you one question to start off with before I go to the questions in the Q&A section, and it's not the one that you're expecting. It's more about, and they came up in the comments more so than in the questions, and that's around the category. So, and I would like to know, is that a post-fire categorisation? Like, you're not expecting to have a fire start and go, oh, that's only a category 0. We'll just leave that one alone.
I'm happy to answer that one. So currently, yes, we're in the post-fire classification stage, where and even at that level, we're having some trouble. Like, if you look at an individual fire, being like, was that a close call category 2, or was it actually a category 3? Like, at the moment, it's sort of like, we've got this theory about these really clear-cut categories, and we've done some work with using the post-incident reporting to classify them, and that's where those numbers come from. Ideally, once we're able to settle on like a post-incident categorization, we'd love to be able to work to predicting the category, because that could be something really, really useful from a triage perspective. But also, if not predicting the category immediately as the fire is reported, some of the early fireground information might be able to like point us towards something. So, for example, the information that we get in a 000 call about and how many 000 calls we get is probably a good indicator of sort of where that fire is sitting. So there's some good opportunities there, but we're not really at that stage yet.
Right. Obviously, there's more work to be done yes. Anyway, I don't want to hog the conversation, because I could, but I might catch up with you offline with all my personal questions, and I'm going to go to the Q&A. The top one that seems to have got a lot of thumbs up from people is regarding the resource tracking. There are some inherent differences in how CFA and FFMV VIC fleets are tracked, particularly once vehicles move to simplex fireground channels. Has this implicated your analysis at all?
Yes, very much so. So it's a really great point. And I think I'd add to that is we also have a lot of private appliances that, of course, aren't tracked. We have contract plant that comes onto a fireground that also isn't part of the tracking system. We've had some differences in FF and VIC and how, like changing to fireground channels and how historically that has affected the tracking. And I think what that has meant for us is that it's difficult to do this analysis automatically. So we've spent a lot of time on firegrounds talking to incident controllers, sector commanders, crews on the ground, and being like, could you tell us about who was here and what they were doing, and trying to do some validation of that? Because if you just look at the data on its own, you actually don't get the full picture of what's actually going on.
Yes, I'm sure Matt Plasinski could agree with you with the aerial firefighting research he's doing on that as well. So, but Nick, you were going to add to that.
Only to add that they acknowledge that is slow and important work that is still happening within and outside the context of this project. And so knowing the production rate of a particular dozer and a particular resource combination in a particular landscape is really important, but it's also very slow and difficult work.
Yeah. Great. I'm going to, sorry, Kyle, skip over your question because that's more of a political type question, and I'm not going to ask Nick or Kristy to comment on that. So Bevan asks, are you looking to have, or have you already thought about changes to doctrines and SOPs or practices based on this research?
Yeah, short answer is yes. It is a conversation. And so things like the outcomes framework that we have, there's slow ships to turn, and we want to be like intentional about the conversation that we have there. And so it's great to be at this point of giving the webinar and having done a lot of that internal engagement to date about these sorts of concepts, and the feedback from the field is particularly positive. There's a lot of interest in things, yes, on our outcomes framework, but things like our dispatch processes and the way we dispatch resources in the acknowledgement of the bottlenecks we'd expect in different parts of the landscape. We could send 100 tankers into deep forest, but they're not going to be able to do anything. That's a pretty extreme example, but we are sort of moving towards what we could do in that space to improve that sort of more response context.
Yep, great. And I think that kind of might answer Kelsey's question as well about going into training. So I'm going to skip now to George's question. And does the study quantify remote ignitions versus ignitions in built-up areas?
I think that we've probably some of the potential operational delineations work really lends itself towards remote landscape fires. But I guess the question there is that as soon as you start to look at this statistically, you end up with essentially an ignition model looks a lot like a population model because you just have a lot more activity near the town and people. And so there hasn't been anything directly to come out of this work from that specifically, but it hasn't exactly been the problem we've been looking at.
Great. Now this goes to the question I did want to ask, and that is about what exciting opportunities do you see for new technologies in this space? And also, someone's moved the questions. Anura's question, but is there a role for AI in quickly assessing a fire against all of the parameters?
Yes, happy to answer. I might do the second part of the question first, which I guess relates to what I was saying about that if we're looking to predict a category of fire, there's potentially some good opportunities there with early fireground intelligence. Bit of a plug for a current project that we have with the Bushfire Emerging Technologies Hub through AFAC, which is looking at that, is how capable is AI to take in a bunch of streams of information and kind of tell us something about the fire. So I think there is really good potential there. I think what we lack is validated training data, where we need to kind of, as I've already said, with things like the resource tracking, there's so many gaps in the data that we get in, and to be able to actually effectively use AI in this space, we need to be like fixing our data sources and checking them and making sure they're reflecting reality. In terms of like the role of technology, I think it's related to that in just collecting more data. And one of the big ones that I am quite interested in is, you saw I showed a lot of pie graphs about the percentage of time spent on containing fires and doing activities. I think we could do, like, all of that is done manually at the moment, and there's potentially some good opportunities there with looking at when are trucks using water. We already do this sort of work with aircraft where we know when drops occur, and there's potentially some really good information we could get from getting more information from our trucks in that space.
Yep. Look, I think we've just got time for one more quick question. I hope it's a good question. Are in all those links that you provided, someone's refreshed my screen again, is there data about the effectiveness of different types of tanker resources available in all of that data, or can that be made available?
Of tanker resources specifically?
Yeah, that's what the question says. So
yeah, yes, there is. And I think there's this point around like the production rates is like how much water can, or how much fire line can a tanker contain per hour. And given there's a few overseas people, we should specify that that's like ground-based firefighting trucks in that sense. Yes, we have some information on that, but across all the different case studies, of which there have been, how many? North of 50, I think. Yeah. There's really only anecdotal stuff we can put around the production rate of that, because the bottlenecks in terms of how far they need to drive from water, simple things like did they get bogged on the way there, and how many fences did they come across, tend to have more of an influence over the production rate than anything that how fast the driver can drive while the person's spraying water. So yes, we have numbers, but I wouldn't be saying that they'd be significant enough to say that it's consistent, and sort of the rules of thumb we have for that are probably no better or worse than stuff that we can put from that analysis. And that's really why we push towards some of these other frameworks to look at this problem.
I'll just add one sentence onto that, which is that we came in thinking that production rate of tankers would be what we were trying to quantify, and then we found very few examples of that actually happening. So it kind of changed how much we could measure that. So, yeah.
Right. Well, unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. We've got to let people get back to, if they're in the US and Canada, probably back to bed, and the UK to have their breakfast. So thanks again for a fantastic presentation. Personally, I loved seeing all the aerial firefighting photos, and I think a big shout out to Rigsy, who I think is online for most of the ones that I love. Anyway, onwards and upwards. It has been an invaluable presentation. I'll take this opportunity to thank the Country Fire Authority Victoria for co-hosting this webinar with us, and also acknowledging the work of DEECA on this topic as well. When you leave the call, we are going to ask you to take a quick survey, and really appreciate you taking just a couple of minutes, because it's going to help us develop the professional development sessions aligned to your needs. It has been my pleasure to host you this afternoon. Until next time, stay well. On behalf of AFAC, the CFA, Kristy and Nick, thank you for joining us here today. Bye, everybody.